Sports betting has a more than $4.7 billion impact in Minnesota and supports 31,000 jobs and counting, according to the American Gaming Association. And some want to see it expand even more. But a recent research study also finds that as sports betting spreads, credit card debt increases and overdraft frequency rises as well. To talk us through this complex issue, I'm now joined by Senator John Marty, who has argued against expanding sports betting in Minnesota. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
My pleasure.
All right, so last session, a bipartisan group of lawmakers nearly got a sports gambling bill to the floor for a vote. What are we expecting this year?
I'm sure they're going to try again, but I want to emphasize there's bipartisan concern and opposition to it as well. And I think that if they had a vote on the floor, would it have passed? It might have, it might not have. What we have going different this year is there's more evidence as states have been legalizing of the problems related to it. You mentioned one of the studies that came out last summer talking about more credit card debt, more bankruptcies. States that have it have huge increases in bankruptcies, and it's only a small number of people who have the addiction, which suggests a whole lot of the people with the addiction are filing for bankruptcy, and it's a huge problem. We also had studies talking about how it increases risk of domestic violence. We've had studies, we know for a fact that gambling addiction is the most deadly in terms of suicide. Minnesota Gambling Treatment Program director said that more than half the people in the program have thought about suicide, and more than 1 in 5 have attempted suicide. That's far more deadly in suicide risks than any other kind of addiction. So we want to talk about the harms caused by sports betting, not just who profits from it, which has been the total debate for like 30 hearings over the years.
And we know that that harm doesn't only affect the players, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. It affects their families, everybody else. I mean, if you look at one of the people we had testifying, I had a hearing on the harms of sports betting. There's never been one, so we had an informational hearing a couple weeks ago. And in that hearing, we had a guy talking about how a lawyer who talked about one of his clients. He was going to court over the children and the spouse of the gambler. The gambler had spent double, triple mortgage. He had spent all the kids' college funds. He spent everything they had. And it doesn't just affect the gambler. It affects their employer, who they often swindle from. It affects their families. It affects the whole community.
Senator, when it comes to public support for legalizing sports betting, some argue there's always a risk and we can't protect everyone from everything. How do you respond to that?
Sure. First of all, in terms of how much support for there is, Missouri last year, they spent tens of millions of dollars to pass a sports betting initiative. Virtually no big money on the other side, but it was tens of millions of dollars promoting it. It squeaked by with a few thousand votes statewide. So it's not overwhelmingly popular, even when they market it and market it and market it. So it's not that popular, first of all. And what about protecting people? Yeah, well, first of all, let's keep in mind, you can bet in Minnesota on sports with your friends, with your neighbors, with strangers, anybody you want. That's not illegal now. If you wanted to bet on the Vikings game a few weeks ago, well, it would have been a tough bet on a lot of things, but you could do it. What we don't have legal is what I'd call predatory sports bookmaking. The people, the corporations, FanDuel, DraftKings, and others, who profit by being predators on the people who are at risk. And so to me, most important thing is if we're going to do this, we got to make sure we have every possible protection and every block on the predators from being able to go in and be predators. I'll give you an analogy for this. In Minnesota, like every other state, we have dram shop laws. If you go into a bar and they see you're looking intoxicated, they will get sued. They have a criminal liability if they serve you more alcohol when they see you're intoxicated. Here we have the predators coming in, and right when you're at risk of this, they offer you free bets. That's like saying you go into a bar and you're drunk, and they say, oh, well, we look like you like a free drink. I mean, in other words, we want to stop the predatory behavior. That's what we have to do most. Because yes, people, even without legal sports betting, do have addictions, and we've got to address them as much as we can. But if we're going to allow a predator in to profit off of that, we got to have extra safeguards.
Well, and speaking of that, a member from your caucus has suggested legislation to create consumer protections on sports betting. What are your thoughts on this proposal?
Sure. I think his proposal doesn't have safeguards of the sort we need. I introduced a bill last year, we'll do it again this year, that has, if Minnesota's going to move forward on this, it should have these safeguards in terms of making sure the companies are liable if they're pushing it on people who are at risk of addiction, if they make safeguards to make sure they can't market it because kids are the ones who see the marketing, all those kind of safeguards, and the proponents say, oh, we got the safest proposal in the country. Well, the country doesn't have safe proposals, period. If we're going to do it, I'd say my bill has safeguards, but the trouble is the industry doesn't like them because they don't profit as much. That's pure and simple the difference. But no, I want those safeguards, but I want a bill with real safeguards.
Okay. A proposal has been set forth by the Republican caucus as well. It's being called the Minnesota Sports Betting Act 2.0. Have you read it yet? Do you find it to be an improvement on previous ones?
I haven't seen this year's Republican bill, but last year's one was pretty similar to the other one. They're just shifting who's making the profits off of it. They're not doing anything to address all the harm. And when I had that hearing a couple weeks ago, it was the Finance Committee. As chair of the Finance Committee, everybody talks about, oh, sports betting is going to give you more money. Well, their bills take all the money, all the tax money coming out of it, and give it to gambling industry, other gambling interests. They don't give money to the state, and I'm looking at the concerns, the addiction concerns, the mental health problems in the schools, the risk of those things, the problems increasing homelessness, problems with people losing their homes because of gambling. We've got all those additional costs that will have a huge impact on the state budget. So I want to make sure we address that. So I think the Republican bill is very similar to the DFL bill. They're both two peas in a pod. They don't really change the problem.
Okay. So you mentioned having the hearing and the committee. Who else needs to be in the room when these discussions are being had?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the public, including those who have been victims of this, they've got to be heard too. Domestic violence advocates have to be heard on the risk of anything that's going to make domestic violence worse. Even a small increase in that is not acceptable. And addressing all the problems with homelessness and everything else, I think we have to have a much broader conversation that doesn't just talk about what the industry, the quote you had at the beginning, they say, oh, we create all these new jobs. Well, they create all these new harms too, and they profit off those jobs. We pay the cost of the harm. So I want to make sure we do that. And I also think we ought to point out, because they all act as if everybody in the world loves this, everybody's doing it, we're 38 states or something have done it. They keep saying all of our neighboring states have done it. No, Iowa has done it. If you want to sports bet in Wisconsin or North or South Dakota, you can't do the predatory online sports betting. You cannot do that. They only allow at casino property. And so when they say 38 states and everybody's doing it, no. A lot of the states are doing that, and I think 5 years from now, you're going to find out a whole lot of the states that did it are going to be trying to, how do we back away from this? And once the cat's out of the bag, it's kind of hard to get it back in. So I think we should be doing this preventively. Let's make sure, if we're going to legalize it, let's put the safeguards in.
So you mentioned those other 38 states. Is there anything that we can learn from them so far? You mentioned 5 years down the line, but right now,
Right.
What are we learning from them?
Well, we learned, among other things, a lot of them have had tripling of their calls on their gambling addiction hotlines. We've learned that the industry, the number one thing the industry says, well, it's better that we regulate the market and tax the market than have the unregulated offshore stuff. And there is this illegal offshore stuff. And they came in, when the sports books came and met with me, they said, oh, they don't even check for age. We restrict kids for age. We're going to drive them out. No, they don't drive them out. Massachusetts legalized it a couple of years ago. And what they found out, their commission, which was kind of pro-gambling stuff, acknowledged that a year and a half, 2 years in, they hadn't made any dent in the offshore market. It actually increased. Why? Because kids, in the states that have it, there's just nonstop advertising. You watched the Vikings-Lions game a couple weeks ago, and you saw plenty of ads on it, even though it's not legal in Minnesota, because they're national things. If we have it here, it will be nonstop marketing. And if you're a high school kid, some of your friends are betting offshore illegally and so on, it's not, maybe you don't get hooked into it, but when you watch a football game and every minute you're seeing new ads for this stuff, it drives more people, and they can't bet legally here, so they go to the offshore market. So I'd say that one of the things we've learned is that when they say, when the industry says this will displace the illegal market, they're wrong. It doesn't. It increases the illegal market.
Thinking about just how it comes up every year, what would make a comprehensive plan to you?
Sure. Well, if the bill I've introduced, and will introduce again this year, it would basically restrict, if you're going to advertise, which they want to do, first of all, you can't do it on any public facilities, which all of our sports facilities are technically owned by the public. So they can't have on-site logos on the sidelines and everything where people constantly see it. You can't market on TV or newspaper or social media or anywhere if more than 10% of the market is people under 21. Because like in a Super Bowl game, where you have hundreds of thousands of kids watching it, they would allow advertising that. We're saying if it's more than 10% of the audience is underage, you shouldn't be able to do it. That kind of restriction makes a difference. And all this stuff saying the companies, if they push, because they know more details about their gamblers than anybody. They know when you've stepped away from it. They have these VIP treatment people for the big gamblers, that usually the problem people. They have people who will go in, you haven't been betting a lot this week, and they'll call you and say, here, would you like a $500 free bet kind of thing, to and hook them in and so on. We want to make sure that if they're doing that, they're liable for it. Same thing that liquor stores are, same thing that that the tobacco industry is in. They're all liable if they're pushing stuff on other people. I think this industry needs it held too. So if we passed a bill like mine, I'd say I'm not a big fan of it. I don't mind people doing what they're doing now, but I don't like the predator coming in. If we're going to do that, I want to make sure we have this. So I accept my bill, I think, is acceptable. The other bills have all the loopholes and all the gaps in it, and it's going to basically grow our addiction problems tremendously.
Senator, any last thoughts on this topic?
As you said, it's been around several years. I expect it will be again, but the biggest change in the last few years is now we're seeing the harms from this, and it is becoming a crisis in the country, and I don't want Minnesota to add to that crisis. So I think we can be the first state to actually put in some legal stuff to say, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right.
All right. Thank you, Senator.
My pleasure.